What happens when a woman paid to destroy relationships ends up falling for her target? Meet Zoe, a hard-hearted, hardened con artist who thinks love is a scam, until Mason Blackwood, a billionaire with secrets of his own, flips her entire world upside down. Lies, betrayal, and an unexpected baby twist lead to a love story no one saw coming. Will Zoe risk everything for the truth or walk away forever? Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next unforgettable story. Zoe Rivera had always believed love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Raised in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a fridge that groaned louder than her stomach, she learned early that affection didn't pay bills, but money did. So she chose a career that most would call scandalous, if not outright immoral. She was a professional relationship wrecker. Her services didn't come cheap, and her rules were clear: no sex, no strings, just enough seduction to ignite suspicion or trigger heartbreak, then vanish before things got too real. It was a game she'd mastered until today. It started with a phone call that came in just past noon while Zoe was painting her nails a soft lavender. The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled, and unmistakably rich. "My name is Claudia Duar. I'm looking for someone with your particular talents." Zoe arched a brow, already sensing dollar signs. "Depends. Whose heart are we breaking?" "Not the heart, just the illusion of one," Claudia replied coolly. "My niece, Olivia, is engaged to a man neither of us want in the family. His name is Mason Blackwood. Billionaire, playboy. Billionaire, playboy. A scandal waiting to happen." Zoe whistled. She'd wrecked a few marriages and ruined a handful of proposals, but this sounded like an elite-level job. And elite jobs came with elite pay. So what's the plan? You seduce him, tempt him, make it look like he's the one cheating. Olivia will show the footage to her parents, and the engagement will be called off. She gets her freedom. You get your cut, $500,000. Zoe's eyes widened. Her heart skipped a beat, not for Mason, but for that glorious number, $500,000. For one job, one night of playing pretend. She nearly dropped the phone from excitement. You've got yourself a deal. 2 days later, she stood in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, assessing her reflection. She had opted for a light pink dress tight enough to leave little to the imagination, but not vulgar. On her head sat a playful bunny ear headband, a nod to the persona she knew men like Mason wouldn't resist. Her long dark hair curled at the ends, cascading down her shoulders like velvet ribbons. She applied one last touch of gloss and blew a kiss to her reflection. "This is it, Zoe," she whispered. "You're not here to fall in love. You're here to make the guy fall, and crash hard." She arrived at the upscale restaurant 15 minutes early, the kind of place where waiters wore gloves and whispered, and menus didn't bother listing prices. Mason was already inside. Olivia had texted. She scanned the room, and her eyes locked on a man sitting near the window, dark blue shirt, square jaw, tousled chestnut hair, and the kind of smirk that screamed trouble and charm all at once. She strutted over, every step calculated. "Hi." "Are you Mason Blackwood?" He looked up from his drink. His gaze was sharp, assessing, and then a slow smile spread across his lips. "Depends. Are you the entertainment for tonight?" Zoe's lips curled into a flirtatious grin. "You could say that. I'm Zoe Rivera. Your sexy service for the evening." Mason laughed, low and velvety. She took her seat, crossing her legs deliberately, and ordered a glass of red wine. They made small talk well. Mostly Mason boasted about his cars, his vacation homes, and his legendary parties. Zoe giggled at all the right moments, touched his arm just enough to keep him hooked. The man was confident, almost arrogantly so, but she had dealt with worse, much worse. Still, something about him made her uneasy. The way his eyes lingered a little too long, the way he leaned in just a little too close. She could tell he wasn't playing. He wasn't pretending. This man devoured women for sport, and she had just stepped onto his field. No matter. She had a mission, a payday, and a plan. She would make Mason Blackwood fall for her. And then, as always, she would walk away. Mason Blackwood was not what Zoe expected. She dealt with cocky men before Wall Street wolves, wannabe rock stars, even a celebrity chef who tried to garnish her with truffle oil. But Mason was different. From the second she slid into the booth across from him, he had her pulse dancing out of rhythm. He didn't flirt like a man trying to impress her. He flirted like someone who already owned the room, and maybe her too, if she wasn't careful. He never once asked her why she was there, never questioned her intentions. Instead, he leaned back with the ease of someone completely in control, and said, "So what's your game, Pink Bunny?" Zoe flashed her most practiced smile. "I don't play games, I win them." Mason chuckled, eyes roaming down her neckline before drifting lazily back up. "You're bold. I like that." Dinner was fast, almost too fast. He didn't bother drawing things out with appetizers or wine pairings. He snapped his fingers once, ordered a steak, rare, and told the waiter to bring her whatever she wants. She looks expensive. She should have felt insulted. Instead, she was intrigued. And a little thrown off. Because every time she tried to lead the conversation, Mason redirected it. When she ran her foot along his leg under the table, his hand grabbed her ankle mid-sentence and held it just tight enough to make her heart skip. When she leaned in with a sultry line, he replied with one even filthier, making her flush despite herself. This wasn't flirting. This was war. By the time they stepped out into the cool night air, Zoe was rattled. That wasn't supposed to happen. She was the one meant to be in control, to have Mason wrapped around her finger by dessert. Instead, she felt like the one who'd been lured into something far more dangerous than she'd planned. Mason opened the passenger door of a sleek black Bentley and gave her a wink. "Get in, Zoe. The night's just starting." She hesitated a second too long. He noticed. "You're not scared, are you?" "Of you?" she scoffed, sliding in. "Please." But inside, she was already spiraling. They drove in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, just thick, loaded. Every now and then, Mason would glance over, his knuckles tapping the steering wheel, a sly smirk tugging at his lips like he knew something she didn't. By the time they pulled up to a 5-star hotel, Zoe had already decided to cut the night short. She had enough material to twist into an accusation, a few suggestive texts, a sultry dinner, some pictures if needed. She could fake a kiss. It didn't have to go further. But Mason wasn't going to make it easy. "Come on," he said, tossing the keys to the valet. "Let's see what kind of tricks you've got hidden under that jacket." Zoe tried to laugh it off.
"Don't you think this is moving a little fast?"
Mason leaned down until his breath ghosted over her ear. "Darling, I don't do slow." The elevator ride was suffocating. Zoe stood with her back to the mirrored wall, eyes locked on her reflection, while Mason's heat radiated beside her. She didn't even realize he was watching her until he whispered, "You keep looking at yourself like you're trying to remind yourself, who you are." "I know exactly who I am," she said sharply. But it was a lie. Inside the suite, she took a shaky breath and made a move to unzip her jacket, just a distraction. But before her fingers reached the zipper, Mason's hands were already at her waist, pulling her in. His lips didn't just kiss, they claimed. Fierce, unrelenting, maddeningly skilled. She tried to pull back, but he deepened the kiss, one hand sliding up her back, the other gripping her thigh like he was starving for her. Her brain screamed retreat. But her body, it betrayed her. When she finally pushed him away, gasping, Mason didn't look angry, just amused. "You're good," he said, licking his bottom lip. "But you're not just here for fun, are you?" Zoe froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said slowly, like every word tasted like wine. "What if I offered you more to play a different game?" She narrowed her eyes.
What kind of game?
"I need a girlfriend. A fake one. Someone my mother won't hate more than she already hates me. Be that girl. 2 weeks. Pretend. Smile. Get paid. 10 million. Her heart stopped. 10 million. Mason grinned. "So, Zoe, do we have a deal?" Zoe stared at him like he'd just spoken in a different language. $10 million. For pretending to be his girlfriend. Her first instinct was to laugh. This had to be some kind of test, a trap. But Mason looked completely serious, that lazy smirk replaced by something sharper, calculated. He wasn't just throwing money at her. He was making an offer she couldn't refuse, and he knew it. She played it cool, leaning back into the plush armchair like she wasn't secretly doing math in her head. $10 million. That wasn't just life changing. That was a whole new identity. That was a future. "What's the catch?" she asked, voice calm though her heart was sprinting. "No catch," Mason replied smoothly. "You live with me. You smile when I say something stupid. You charm my mother enough to make her think I finally turned a new leaf. And when it's all over, you walk away richer. No strings, no expectations. No strings, no expectations. Just a clean exit." So he hesitated. "Why me?" "Because you don't scare easy," he said, eyes glinting. "And I need someone who can go head to head with Vivian Blackwood without flinching. Olivia was too sweet. You're not." She exhaled slowly, watching him through narrowed eyes. "You do realize I was supposed to seduce you to break off your engagement, right? I was hired to wreck your life, not star in it." "I know," Mason said simply. "But turns out I didn't need help wrecking it. I just needed a partner in the explosion." Zoe bit her lip. The irony wasn't lost on her. She came here to destroy this man, and now she was agreeing to help him pull off a performance for his mother and society. For 10 million, she could fake anything. "All right," she said, holding out her hand. "We have a deal." Mason took it, shaking once, firm and decisive. Welcome to the madness. That night, Zoe returned to her apartment with a branded shopping bag containing a black card and a list of expectations. She was to move into Mason's estate the next morning. Dress elegantly. Be charming. Be believable. His mother didn't tolerate mediocrity. As she packed her bags, her phone buzzed. It was Olivia. "Well," the message read, "did you get the video?" Zoe stared at the screen. The footage she'd intended to record was buried inside her purse, the tiny hidden camera still tucked in the lace of her dress. She had enough steamy moments captured to shake any engagement. But now she was part of a bigger plan. Her fingers hovered over the reply box before she typed. Working on it. The next morning, she slid into Olivia's car, looking more composed than she felt. Olivia wore oversized sunglasses and a blazer too crisp for someone so young. Well, Olivia asked, tapping the steering wheel. Did you do it? Zoe didn't meet her eyes. Things got complicated. Complicated how? He didn't fall for it the way you expected. In fact, he offered me a counter deal. Zoe paused. He wants me to pretend to be his girlfriend. Olivia blinked, stunned. You're kidding. Nope. And you said yes? Zoe shrugged. He offered me 10 million. Olivia's mouth dropped open. 10 million? Just to pretend? Guess he really wants out of marrying you. Olivia let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. This is insane. He's insane. And honestly, I kind of love it. Good. Let him be the one to explain this circus to my parents. I still owe you a video, Zoe said, glancing at her bag. I'll get something. Eventually. You'd better, Olivia said with a sly grin. But I like you, Zoe. You're the most expensive bullet I've ever fired. And I'm not done with you yet. Back at her apartment, Zoe took one long look at her modest life. The cracked mirror. The flickering light in the hallway. She was stepping into a mansion, next, a world of pearls, champagne, and watchful eyes. She zipped her suitcase shut, whispered a quiet goodbye to the life she'd been trying so hard to survive, and stepped out. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a performance on the biggest stage she'd ever known. And she had every intention of stealing the show. The mansion loomed like something out of a magazine, grand, cold, and intimidating in its perfection. Zoe stepped out of the black town car Mason had sent, wearing a champagne-colored dress that shimmered faintly in the sun, the exact one he'd had delivered that morning with a note that simply read, "Impress her." She smoothed the fabric with sweaty palms, took a deep breath, and prepared herself to meet the woman everyone warned her about, Vivian Blackwood. The front doors opened before she could knock. A maid in a crisp uniform nodded politely and gestured for her to enter. The foyer was larger than her entire apartment. Marble floors, gold fixtures, a crystal chandelier. So massive, it looked like it could crush a small car. Zoe's heels clicked softly as she followed the maid through the hall, rehearsing her smile over and over in her head. Nothing too big. Nothing too big. Nothing too fake. Just enough to say, I belong here, even if I clearly don't. Mason was already waiting in a lounge that overlooked the garden, sipping something dark from a glass tumbler. He looked relaxed, wearing a tailored navy suit with the top 2 buttons undone, and his signature "nothing phases me" grin. You clean up nice, he said, eyes grazing her from head to toe. Zoe smirked. You paid for the cleanup, remember? He chuckled and extended his hand. Ready? No, she whispered honestly, taking it anyway. As they approached the veranda, Zoe spotted her. Vivian Blackwood stood like a monument-tall blonde and wrapped in red silk and jewelry that probably had their own insurance policies. She wasn't smiling. Her face was taut, lips pressed in a way that said she'd already made up her mind about Zoe, and it wasn't good. Mason, she said, kissing his cheek with robotic affection. You're late. I brought someone I wanted you to meet, he replied smoothly. This is Zoe Rivera, my girlfriend. Zoe stepped forward and extended her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood. Vivian didn't take her hand. She simply scanned Zoe, eyes sharp as razors. Rivera, she repeated, like the name itself offended her. Zoe slowly let her hand drop. What family are you from? Vivian demanded, without skipping a beat. Mason sighed. Mom. No, Vivian snapped. She wants to be part of this family. I have the right to know who she is. Zoe kept her chin up. I don't have a family, she answered calmly. They passed away when I was young. Vivian's eyes narrowed. What's your profession?
She's between things, Mason interrupted.
Zoe gently raised a hand. No, let me. I've done a little of everything. Waitressing, sales assistant work. Nothing fancy. I didn't go to college. I didn't go to college. I don't own a business. I don't have a trust fund. Just me.
Silence hung heavy.
Vivian crossed her arms. So you're poor. Uneducated, no roots. And you expect me to believe you're with my son for love? Zoe's stomach clenched, but she refused to let it show. I didn't ask to be born without wealth, she said, voice even. But I've worked for everything I've ever had. I don't owe anyone shame for that. Vivian scoffed. You don't deserve him. Zoe's blood boiled, but she smiled sweetly. With all due respect, ma'am, your son decides who he deserves. And if he chooses me, that's his right. Is that so? Vivian said icily. Well, he's made bad choices before. Then maybe he's due for a good one. Vivian's nostrils flared. Mason looked both impressed and slightly terrified. He stepped forward. Mom, I brought Zoe here so you could get to know her, not to humiliate her. Vivian glared at them both, then turned to leave. I'm not done with this conversation. I am, Zoe muttered under her breath. Later, in the guest room, Mason had prepared for her. Zoe sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. Her hands were trembling, but her spine stayed straight. She'd faced worse than judgmental glances and biting words. Still, something about Vivian's stare made her feel like she was back in the alley behind the diner, begging for extra shifts just to afford rent. A soft knock tapped against the door. You okay? Mason asked, leaning in with a cautious look. She hates me, Zoe said simply. She hates everyone, he replied, stepping in. But no one's ever talked back to her like that. Honestly. I think you might have impressed her, or terrified her. Either way, it's a win. Zoe let out a tired laugh and leaned back. I'm not used to pretending this hard. Mason smiled, but there was something else in his eyes. You're doing better than you think. Zoe didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the window at the sprawling lawn below. For $10 million, she could handle Vivian Blackwood. She just hoped her heart wouldn't be the real casualty. Living under the same roof with Mason Blackwood felt like walking through a maze blindfolded. Every hallway of his lavish estate was more elegant than the last. But Zoe never knew what turn might lead her into trouble. On the surface, things were simple. Smile in public, act like his adoring girlfriend, and never let anyone, especially his mother, see the cracks in their little performance. But behind closed doors, the lines between fake and real were starting to blur in dangerous ways. It began with the little things, a brush of his hand against her back as they passed each other in the hall. The way he poured her coffee in the morning, exactly the way she liked it, light cream. No sugar, even though she'd never told him. He always seemed to know when she was on edge, offering a joke or a quiet smirk at just the right moment. She reminded herself over and over that this was just part of the gig. He was charming to make their act believable. But sometimes, when his eyes lingered too long, or when his voice dipped too low as he called her babe, Zoe caught herself wondering if he was pretending anymore. She tried not to let it show. During the day, she mastered the girlfriend routine like a pro, holding his hand at brunches with the city's elite, laughing at his half-hearted stories, stealing glances like a woman head over heels. They attended events, smiled for cameras, and made it look like they were the golden couple everyone envied. And yet, every time Mason wrapped an arm around her waist in front of others, Zoe's stomach did a little flip. She hated herself for. One afternoon, as she stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room, though Mason insisted it was her room, now she tried on a sleek black dress he had ordered for her. The tag was still on it, and she didn't even bother checking the price. She already knew it would be astronomical. As she smoothed the fabric down her sides, the door creaked open, and Mason leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his gaze traveling the length of her body without shame. "I knew that one would look good on you," he said casually. She rolled her eyes. "You pick out my clothes now, too?" "I pick out what makes you look like a goddess," he corrected, smirking. "I have taste." "You have control issues." He shrugged. "Only when it comes to things I like." Zoe turned back to the mirror, pretending not to register the way his words made her chest tighten. "This is exhausting, you know," she muttered. "I've changed 9 times today just for one dinner with your family. You'd think we were meeting the royal court." "You are," Mason replied, stepping closer. "My mother is her own monarchy." She sighed. "It's not just your mother. It's this whole thing. I'm always performing. And I'm good at it, Mason, but even actors get to take a break." He touched her arm gently, his tone softer now. "I get it, but you're not alone in this, Zoe. We're a team, right?" The word team made her flinch a little. A team built on lies. A deal, an act. She gave him a tight smile.
Sure, Team Blackwood.
Later that evening, they sat at the long dining table beside Vivian, who picked at her food like it had personally offended her. Zoe felt the pressure mounting with every minute posture perfect, smile polite, and conversation filtered through layers of etiquette. But the worst part was Mason's hand resting lightly on her thigh under the table. She kept her face neutral, but her heart thundered. When the meal ended, they returned to their wing of the house. Mason closed the door behind them, loosened his tie, and gave her a curious look. "You're quiet." Zoe walked to the window, arms crossed, "because I'm trying not to scream." He stepped behind her, voice low. "About what?" "About this," she gestured around. "The games. Your mother, me, us." Mason hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You knew the rules when you agreed." She turned around to face him, eyes fierce. "Yeah. But I didn't expect you to be, you." "What does that mean?" "It means I didn't expect you to make this feel real." They stood in silence for a beat, too many unsaid things thickening the air between them. Mason finally spoke, voice uncharacteristically raw. "Maybe it is." And just like that, Zoe knew the maze wasn't just the mansion, it was Mason. And somehow, without realizing it, she'd already gotten lost inside. The night began with harmless tension, light flirtation, the kind Zoe had grown used to by now. Mason had returned from a business dinner in a crisp black suit that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and power. His tie was already loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone, and he looked at her like she was dessert. Zoe, curled up on the sofa in one of his oversized shirts, had only meant to tease him, maybe steal a smile or two. Nothing dangerous, nothing serious. But then the teasing went too far. She'd said something sarcastic, something about how he should stop acting like he had a claim over her, and in response, Mason had walked over, slowly, with that glint in his eyes she had come to recognize, the one that warned her he wasn't going to play by the rules tonight. "Claim you?" he'd said, voice rough. "You think I don't already?" Before she could answer, he leaned in and kissed her hard. And despite every part of her brain shouting, "This is a job, this is a job, this is not real," Zoe melted. His lips tasted like wine and danger. His hand found the small of her back and pulled her in, bodies pressed close, heat pulsing between them like electricity. Her fingers curled into his shirt before she even realized they'd moved. She told herself it was part of the act, that leaning into the kiss was just better performance. But when he whispered her name like a prayer, when he traced her jaw with his fingertips and said, "You drive me insane." Zoe couldn't lie to herself anymore. She wanted him too. For a moment, she let go, let herself feel. Her hands found his chest, and her breath hitched as he gently lifted her onto the sofa, kissing her like he'd been starving for her. Everything about the moment was dizzying: the weight of his body, the softness of his touch, the way he looked at her like she was the only real thing in his world. But then it snapped. Zoe's eyes fell on her purse across the room. Inside, it was the hidden camera she'd forgotten to remove. It had been on since earlier, capturing everything. Panic flooded her. She broke the kiss, her voice breathless and cracked. "Wait." He froze, eyes searching hers. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," she whispered, sitting up and smoothing down her shirt. "You didn't. I can't do this. Not right now." Mason sat back, frowning slightly, chest rising and falling like he was trying to keep himself calm. "Zoe, talk to me. What's going on?" She stood up quickly, turning her back to him. "I just need air." But instead of leaving, she walked to her purse, heart hammering, and discreetly flipped off the camera. Her fingers trembled. Guilt clung to her skin like sweat. Mason walked up behind her. "Was it something I said?" She turned slowly, forcing a small smile. "No, it's me. You're a mystery, Zoe," he said quietly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "But I'm starting to want to figure you out." That should have terrified her. Instead, it made her chest ache. Later that night, she sat alone in her room, holding the tiny memory card between her fingers. She could give it to Olivia tomorrow. She had more than enough footage now: kissing, intimacy, everything that would convince her family that Mason was unfaithful. She could take the bonus. Walk away rich. But every time she replayed the moment in her mind, it didn't feel like acting. It didn't feel fake. It felt like the beginning of something real. And real was dangerous. Real meant consequences. Zoe shoved the memory card into her jewelry box and slammed it shut. She couldn't let herself fall. Not for the man she was paid to destroy. She crawled into bed, pulled the covers over her head, and closed her eyes tightly, trying to ignore the phantom feeling of his lips still burning on her skin. For the first time in years, money didn't feel like enough, and that terrified her more than anything else. The morning light spilled through the tall windows like golden syrup, warming the edges of the oversized bed Zoe had barely slept in. Her limbs ached, not from exhaustion, but from restraint. She had spent the night curled up in a tight ball, mind racing with memories she didn't ask for. The way Mason touched her, the way he whispered her name, like it was a secret only he was allowed to say. And, worst of all, the look in his eyes that made her forget, even for a moment, that everything between them had started as a lie. She sat up slowly, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. Her eyes landed on the purse sitting on the dresser across the room. The camera, the footage, the job. Olivia had texted twice already this morning, asking if she had the goods. The evidence. "We need to end this, Zoe." Her last message read, "I want out." Zoe didn't answer. Instead, she walked barefoot to the dresser and pulled the tiny device from her bag, flipping through the footage. The screen showed exactly what she feared: kisses too real, touches too desperate, the kind of intimacy that no amount of acting could fake. She looked at her own face in the video and hated what she saw. Not a con artist, not a professional. Just a girl falling in love with the man she was paid to ruin. She powered off the device, heart pounding, then yanked the memory card free. It was so small, barely the size of her fingertip, but it carried the weight of her guilt like an anchor. Her fingers trembled as she held it over the trash can. She wanted to let go. She wanted to be free of this mess. But her hand wouldn't move. Instead, she slipped the card into a velvet pouch and stuffed it into her suitcase, away from sight but never out of mind. The decision had been made. She needed to leave. Zoe scribbled a note on a scrap of hotel stationery Mason had left on the nightstand. Whatever we shared ends here. Don't think my heart was false. I did love you, but don't look for me anymore. She left the note by his pillow and walked out before she could change her mind. The car waiting outside was Olivia's. Zoe slid into the passenger seat, not saying a word. Olivia glanced at her. You okay? Zoe shook her head. No, but I'll be fine. Do you have it? Zoe hesitated, then shook her head again. No, I'm not doing it. Olivia's brows furrowed. What? I'm giving you the money back. I'm sorry. Zoe. I can't explain it. I can't give you that video, and I can't stay there. Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden knock on the car window startled them both. Zoe turned and froze. Mason stood outside, eyes stormy, chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. His hair was tousled. He looked furious, heartbroken, alive. Zoe's heart dropped. She stepped out before Olivia could stop her. Mason, how did you? I knew, he said sharply. I knew you'd run. I knew you'd leave before I even woke up. She tried to respond, but her mouth went dry. I also knew you were hired, he added, quieter now. I knew about Olivia, about the plan. I knew everything, Zoe. She blinked. You knew. I did, but I still let you stay. I still let myself believe it could be more than a deal. She staggered back, breath stolen. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm in love with you, Mason said, stepping forward, eyes burning. And I don't want this to end. Zoe's voice cracked. But it has to. No, he said, shaking his head. We may have started with lies, but this, what I feel, it's real. And I know you feel it too. Tears filled her eyes. I do, but I don't deserve you. He reached out, cupping her cheek gently. Then let's start over. No games. No cameras. Just us. And for the first time, she didn't run. She let herself believe. Mason's words hung in the air like a promise and a challenge all at once. Let's start over. No games. No cameras. Just us. For a long moment, Zoe didn't move. Her heart thudded in her chest so loudly she was sure Olivia could hear it from the car. This was the moment she had feared, the one where the truth stood bare between them, no lies, no roles, just raw, complicated reality. And Mason had known all along. You knew, she repeated, barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with disbelief. You knew I was lying to you? He nodded slowly. Zoe felt her knees go weak. So, all this time, you were pretending to? No, Mason said firmly. At first, yes. I needed you to help me escape that ridiculous engagement, and I figured two could play the same game. But then, it stopped being a game for me. Her throat tightened. She looked away, afraid that if she kept looking into his eyes, she'd break. And Olivia, she had her plan, and I had mine. I didn't know she'd actually hired someone to seduce me until I saw a photo of you in her phone. You were labeled Plan B. He gave a dry, bitter laugh, but by the time I found out, I was already in too deep. I let it play out. I needed to know if what I felt for you was real or just part of the act. Zoe winced.
So what did you decide?
Mason stepped closer. I decided I didn't care how it started. I care how it ends. She bit her lip. And how do you think this ends, Mason? I'm not like you. I'm not rich. I'm not rich. I'm not clean. I came into your life as a hired liar, and I let you in knowing that, he said gently. I knew everything and still fell in love with you. Tears threatened to blur her vision, but she blinked them back. Behind them, Olivia rolled down her window just far enough to yell, "This is so much better than the video I wanted." Zoe gave a breathless laugh, one hand covering her mouth. Oh, my God. Olivia shrugged unapologetically. Look, if I can't get out of this engagement with a scandal, I'll take a soap opera. Mason looked at Zoe with a smirk. She's not wrong. We might just stolen the spotlight. But Zoe's smile faded. What about your mom? You really think she's going to let this slide? She already hates me. Mason's face sobered. He reached for her hand and held it gently. She'll come around. Or she won't. Either way, I'm not letting her decide who I love. You're not scared? Zoe asked, genuinely curious. Terrified, he admitted, but losing you scares me more. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words wash over her, calming the storm inside. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a tool or a disposable pawn in someone else's plan. She felt like a woman who was wanted, genuinely, wholeheartedly. She opened her eyes and nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Let's start over. Mason smiled, slow and sincere, like he'd been waiting to hear those words for a lifetime. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, soft and steady. You have no idea how happy I am to hear that. From the car, Olivia let out a loud, dramatic sigh. Okay, lovebirds, we get it. You're in love. Now what? Are we all just going to stand here hugging in a parking lot? Zoe laughed and looked at Mason. What now? He grinned. Now, we go back and tell the truth. She tilted her head. To who? To everyone. And just like that, they climbed into Mason's car, Olivia still making sarcastic comments in the back seat, and drove off, not knowing exactly what awaited them, but finally, for once, not running away from it. Because this time, they weren't acting. This time, it was real. The wedding chapel Olivia dragged them to looked like something out of a vintage romance film, quaint, sun-washed bricks, stained glass windows, and an arched wooden door that creaked as it opened. Zoe stared at it with wide eyes, still trying to comprehend what was happening. 1 minute, she'd been walking away from Mason forever, and now she was standing in front of a church in a designer dress, clutching his hand like her life depended on it. Wait, why are we here again? Zoe asked, spinning toward Olivia, who looked far too giddy for someone escaping her own arranged marriage. Olivia shrugged, clearly delighted with herself. You two are obviously in love. I'm just giving fate a little push. Besides, once you're legally married, my parents can't force Mason to go through with our engagement. It's called checkmate, darling. Mason raised an eyebrow. So you brought us to a church. On impulse? Olivia grinned. Not entirely. I bribed the priest with a new espresso machine. He's inside. Zoe blinked. You bribed a priest? I said, espresso machine, not cash. Relax. Mason chuckled. I have to admit, she's terrifying in the most efficient way. Zoe's heart thundered in her chest as she looked at him. Are you really okay with this? He stepped closer, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I told you I wanted to start over, remember? There's no better place to do that than right here with you. Her lips parted, emotions tangling in her throat. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't know if she deserved this. But the way Mason looked at her, like she was already his world, quieted every doubt. They entered the chapel together. The space was modest but warm, sunlight pouring in through the stained glass, casting colored patterns on the pews. The priest, a balding man with sleepy eyes and a suspiciously brand-new coffee mug in hand, nodded at them with a smile that said, I've seen stranger things. With Olivia acting as the lone witness and occasional heckler, the ceremony began. Zoe's hands trembled as she repeated the vows. She didn't need them written on paper, her heart already knew every word. For better or worse, in wealth or poverty, in lies or in truth, Mason said his vows in a voice so steady, so sincere, she wondered if it was possible to fall in love all over again, just from the way someone said your name. When it was over, the priest declared them husband and wife, and Mason leaned down to kiss her, not like a man claiming a prize, but like someone promising to protect something fragile, something he never wanted to lose. Outside, Olivia clapped like a maniac. That was beautiful. And fast. Just how I like my weddings. Zoe turned to her with a laugh, still breathless. Nope, but it worked out better than mine ever could. You two belong together. As they rode away from the chapel, Mason laced his fingers with Zoe's. She rested her head on his shoulder, watching the world blur past the window. Are you sure we can face your mom after this? She murmured. I'm sure she'll try to murder me, he replied cheerfully. But at least now we'll both go down together. Zoe snorted. Romantic. He grinned. You said you wanted real. In the following days, the chaos came exactly as expected. Vivian Blackwood did not take the news well. She refused to speak to Mason, sent angry voicemails, and tried unsuccessfully to have the marriage annulled through a family lawyer. None of it mattered. The license was legal, the ceremony binding, and Zoe's name was now permanently attached to the Blackwood legacy. But even in the storm of scandal, Mason never let go of her hand. He moved her into the master bedroom, insisted she redecorate however she pleased, and cooked her breakfast badly every morning, always burning the toast. He took her to events and introduced her proudly as his wife, ignoring every glare and whisper, and every night, when they came home, he kissed her like it was the first time. Zoe had come into his life as a con, but somehow, impossibly, she had become his home. And that truth, however unlikely, was now hers, too. Zoe never imagined she'd find peace inside a house where she once felt like an outsider. But now, with the Blackwood estate slowly softening into something that resembled home, she found herself waking each morning with a strange sense of calm. Mason's presence was steady, grounding like the world could burn around them, and he'd still manage to hand her coffee with a crooked grin. Their marriage, though sudden, had begun to feel less like a plot twist and more like a destiny, rewritten. She'd never believed in fate, but the way Mason looked at her every day made her want to. Vivian, however, remained the shadow at the edge of that peace. She hadn't spoken to Mason since the wedding. No calls, no visits, just silence and a few passive, aggressive, Aggressive headlines leaked to the tabloids about her son falling for a gold digger with no pedigree. Zoe saw them all and kept her chin up, pretending they didn't sting. Still, Mason never pressured her. He defended her at every turn, whether it was to his colleagues, family friends, or distant relatives who suddenly remembered they had opinions. He made it clear she was his wife in name, heart, and choice. One crisp autumn morning, Zoe's world shifted again. She stood barefoot in the bathroom, holding a thin plastic stick in her trembling hands. Two pink lines stared back at her, bold and undeniable. Pregnant, pregnant. Her knees buckled, and she sat on the tiled floor, heart pounding so loud it echoed in her ears. For a moment, the old Zoe resurfaced, the girl who never had a safety net, who ran from anything permanent, anything that could be taken away. But this time, she wasn't alone. She walked downstairs, still pale, and found Mason in the kitchen, wearing his usual half-buttoned shirt and apron that said "Kiss the Chef." He was burning pancakes again. He turned when he saw her, smiling. "Hey, sweetheart. You're just in time for another kitchen disaster." "Mason," she said softly, holding out the test. Her hands were shaking. "We need to talk." He frowned, taking the stick from her hand. His eyes scanned the result, and for a long second, he didn't say a word. Then his gaze met hers. "You're serious?" he whispered. She nodded. "I just found out. I don't know what this means for us, but..." Mason dropped the spatula, took 3 steps toward her, and pulled her into his arms. His hug was so tight she could barely breathe. "It means everything," he murmured against her hair. "Zoe, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Are you sure?" He pulled back and cupped her face. "You could give me $100 billion business deals, and I'd still choose this moment." They spent the rest of the day wrapped in a quiet joy. Mason called it their first official family holiday and insisted on ordering enough food for a small army. Zoe found herself laughing, more than she had in weeks. For once, the future didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a promise. But just as life began to fall into place, the unexpected happened. Late one evening, Zoe heard a soft knock on the front door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Vivian Blackwood stood on the doorstep, dressed impeccably in a deep burgundy coat, her eyes unreadable. "Mrs. Blackwood," Zoe said, stunned. Vivian looked her up and down, lips tight. "Is Mason home?" "He's upstairs," Zoe replied carefully. Vivian hesitated, then nodded once. Yes. As they walked into the living room, the silence stretched between them. Zoe sat on the edge of the couch, trying to keep her nerves in check. Vivian glanced around the space like she was seeing it for the first time. "I saw the article," she said at last, "about the baby." Zoe froze. "I didn't come here to fight," Vivian added quickly. "I came because I don't want to repeat my past mistakes." Zoe looked at her, surprised. Vivian exhaled deeply. "I was hard on you. Too hard. I've seen what you've done for Mason. You've changed him in ways I never could." Zoe blinked. I just love him." "I can see that." Vivian paused, her voice softening. Zoe stared at her, emotions colliding. Then slowly, she smiled. "Yes. Of course." And just like that, the last wall between them began to crumble. Love, after all, was the only thing strong enough to change even the hardest hearts. Zoe didn't expect the delivery to be easy, but Nothing could have prepared her for just how intense it would be. The contractions started just past midnight sharp and relentless. Mason had jumped out of bed the moment she clutched her belly, panic and excitement flashing across his face as he scrambled to grab the hospital bag she had packed 3 weeks earlier. "It's happening," Zoe had whispered through gritted teeth, breathless from the pain. "Mason, she's coming." I know," he muttered, nearly tripping over his own feet as he helped her down the stairs and into the car. "You're okay. We've got this. I'm here, Zoe. I'm right here." At the hospital, everything became a blur of nurses, machines, and clipped instructions. Mason never left her side, not even for a second. He held her hand through every contraction, whispered encouragements when she thought she couldn't take another second, and kissed her temple when the exhaustion left her trembling. Hours passed. The sun rose, and then finally, with one last push, a cry filled the room. "She's here," Mason breathed, eyes wide with awe. Zoe collapsed back into the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks as the nurse gently placed their newborn daughter on her chest. The baby was tiny, pink, and perfect. She let out a soft cry as Zoe touched her cheek for the first time. "Hi, sweetheart," Zoe whispered, voice cracking. "We've been waiting for you." Mason stood beside them, utterly mesmerized. He looked like he'd just witnessed a miracle, and maybe he had. He leaned down, pressed a kiss to Zoe's forehead, then another on his daughter's. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mom." A few hours later, after the initial wave of doctors and nurses had cleared, the hospital room settled into a peaceful quiet. Zoe lay back in the bed, cradling the baby while Mason sat next to her, one hand resting protectively on their daughter's tiny back. The door creaked open. Lily poked her head in, holding a bouquet of pink and white roses and a massive teddy bear. "Can I come in?" Zoe smiled. "Of course." Lily stepped inside, her usual sass replaced by genuine warmth. She tiptoed to the bed and peered down at the baby. "Oh my God. She's the cutest thing I've ever seen." "She gets it from me," Mason said smugly. Zoe rolled her eyes. "You wish." Behind Lily, another figure appeared in the doorway, Vivian. She hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure if she was welcome. But then, Zoe looked up and gave her a small, welcoming smile. "Come meet your granddaughter." Vivian entered the room slowly, clutching her designer handbag like it was a shield. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, softened the moment they landed on the baby. She didn't say a word at first, just stared. "She has your eyes," Zoe said gently. Vivian blinked, clearly surprised by the kindness. "May I?" Zoe nodded. "Of course." Vivian reached out, her hands trembling slightly, and cradled the baby as if she were holding the rarest, most delicate treasure in the world. Her eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong about you," she whispered to Zoe. "You're not what I expected. You're better." Zoe's chest tightened. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They sat in silence for a moment, the 3 generations of women united in a quiet bond none of them had foreseen. As Vivian gently placed the baby back in Zoe's arms, Lily wiped at her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Stop making me cry. I'm not emotionally equipped for this." Everyone laughed, and for the first time since Zoe entered the Blackwood world, everything felt whole. Later, as evening fell and visitors trickled out, Mason lay beside Zoe in the narrow hospital bed, careful not to disturb the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. He watched them in the dim light, his heart full in a way it had never been before. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought her into the world." Zoe leaned her head against his. "We did it." He looked at her, eyes glistening. More than I already did. But now... Zoe smiled sleepily. Well, I've got one more surprise. What? Why? We never picked a name, she whispered. But I think I know what it should be. Mason raised an eyebrow. Oh, yeah. Zoe looked down at the baby, then back at him. Hope. Because that's what she gave us. And in that moment, with their daughter nestled between them and their hearts completely exposed, Mason kissed her hand and nodded. Hope Blackwood. Perfect. Months passed like pages in a book Zoe never wanted to end. Life, once chaotic and uncertain, settled into something beautiful and steady. Their days were filled with soft morning feedings, sleepy smiles, and evenings spent curled up on the couch with Hope nestled between them. Zoe had never known this kind of peace, this quiet, warm kind of love that didn't demand anything, only gave. And Mason. He was the father she didn't even know to hope for. Tender, playful, fiercely protective. He took to fatherhood like he'd been waiting his whole life for it. But there was one person Zoe hadn't expected to grow closer to Vivian. Their relationship, once thorny and tense, had softened after Hope's birth. Vivian visited often now, sometimes bringing fresh flowers, sometimes just sitting in the nursery and watching Hope sleep. At first, Zoe had been cautious, unsure of how much of the change was real. But with every quiet apology, every gentle smile, every unsolicited parenting tip that actually turned out to be helpful, Vivian slowly rebuilt something she thought had long crumbled, a connection, not just with her son, but with the woman he loved. One morning, while Mason was at work and Hope napping, Vivian stopped by with a small velvet box. I know it's a little early, she said as Zoe opened the door, but I wanted to give this to you before your church wedding next month. Zoe blinked. You didn't have to. Vivian held up a hand. I wanted to. May I come in? Zoe stepped aside, leading her into the sitting room. She sat as Vivian placed the box into her hands. Open it, she urged, her voice softer than usual. Zoe lifted the lid. Inside lay a necklace, delicate gold, and adorned with a small charm shaped like a star, inset with a single diamond. It belonged to my grandmother, Vivian said quietly. She gave it to me on my wedding day, and I'd like you to wear it at yours. Zoe stared at the necklace, unable to speak for a moment. Vivian. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Vivian replied with a slight smile. Say you'll let me walk you down the aisle with that around your neck. Tears filled Zoe's eyes as she nodded. Yes, of course, yes. The grand wedding arrived on a crisp spring afternoon. The church was nothing like the small chapel where they'd first said I do. This one was enormous, filled with light, echoing with music and laughter. Friends, family, and even a few shocked socialites filled the pews. But Zoe only saw Mason. He stood at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, hands clasped, eyes fixed on her like she was the answer to every question he'd never dared ask. Zoe walked slowly down the aisle, not alone this time, but with Vivian holding her arm, both of them fighting back emotion. The necklace rested on her collarbone, a quiet symbol of how far they'd come. When she reached Mason, he took her hands gently. You look like heaven, he whispered. And you, she smiled, still look like trouble. They both laughed. The ceremony was everything they hadn't had the first-time vows spoken from the heart, a room full of love, and a kiss that melted away every scar from the past. Afterward, at the reception, guests toasted to their story, the con that turned into something real. Olivia, naturally, gave the most dramatic speech of all. Let's be honest, she began, raising her glass. None of this was supposed to happen. I hired Zoe to break Mason's heart. Mason tried to outsmart us all. And somehow this turned into a real-life fairy tale. Honestly, I feel like I should get partial credit for the happy ending. Everyone laughed. Even Zoe, wiping away a tear. Later that night, when the music had faded and guests had gone, Zoe and Mason stood under the stars outside the venue, barefoot and full of champagne. "I still can't believe this is real," she murmured, her head on his shoulder. He kissed her forehead. "Believe it. We earned it." She smiled, pressing a hand to her belly. Mason's eyes widened.
Zoe!
She nodded slowly. "Yeah, we've got another one on the way." He laughed, stunned, then pulled her into a tight hug. "You've got to stop surprising me like this." "No chance," she whispered against his chest. And beneath the night sky, surrounded by dreams they never thought they deserved, they danced slowly, silently, to a song only their hearts could hear. Life lesson. This story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful things in life begin with imperfection. Zoe and Mason started from a lie, a plan built on manipulation and escape. But what they found through it all was something neither of them expected: love that was real, raw, and transformative. It teaches us that people are not defined by their pasts or where they come from, but by the choices they make when it truly matters. Zoe came from nothing, and Mason had everything. But it wasn't wealth or status that held them together. It was honesty, growth, and the courage to forgive. We learn that love isn't about perfection or a flawless beginning. It's about persistence, vulnerability, and the willingness to see beyond mistakes. Even those who start as enemies can become family. Even a heart that was hardened by pain, like Vivian's, can be softened by truth and kindness. And even the most complicated relationships can heal if we're brave enough to open our hearts. At the end of the day, it's not how your story starts that matters most. It's how you choose to finish it. Did this story move you or make you think? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories filled with love, drama, and lessons that stick with you long after the ending, don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next one. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.